My daughter's brilliant lie saved us. Or so we thought. Last time, Chloe did something I never could have. She looked my husband in the eye and told a story so convincing it shifted his entire suspicion off of us. But her lie was like turning a loaded gun away from our heads, only to realize we'd just aimed it at a barrel of gasoline. Because now, Michael believes he's found the one true source of all our family's problems, my ex-husband, Mark. He didn't yell, he didn't pace, he got calm. And in our house, there is nothing more terrifying than Michael's calmness. It's the stillness of a predator just before it strikes. He stood up, grabbed his jacket, and walked past me. "I'm going out for a bit," he said softly. "I need to take care of something." Take care of something. The same words a mob boss would use. I knew exactly where he was going, and I knew I couldn't stop him. Today, you're going to be a fly on the wall for the showdown we've all been waiting for. My cold, calculating husband versus my charming, manipulative ex. Two predators, one cage. But this isn't a fight. It's a game of chess, a battle of willpower, truth, and control. And the fallout from this meeting? It introduces a terrifying new player to our story, one we never saw coming. Let's get into it. The moment his car left the driveway, our house transformed from a prison into a war room, and the countdown had already begun. We converged in the living room like magnets snapping together, the silence he left behind now replaced with shared panic. Chloe was the first to crack. Her face was pale, her hands twisted the hem of her shirt. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice shaking. "What's he going to do to my dad?" My instinct kicked in, the mother bear reflex. "I don't know," I said, already reaching for my phone. "We have to warn him." "No." The word was sharp, cold, and it came from Leo. He stood there, arms crossed, eyes locked on mine, his voice calm in a way that was way too old for 16. "Don't," he said again. "If you warn Mark, Dad will know Chloe lied. He'll know we're all in this together. We have to let this play out." And right there, in our living room, came the first real fracture in our alliance. A daughter's heart, terrified for the father she still loved, versus a son's cold logic, choosing strategy over sentiment. And I was stuck in the middle, the impossible place every step-parent ends up in, between the child you raised and the child you've come to love. Except this wasn't about chores or curfews. This was about a potential explosion, and I was holding the match. That's the hardest part of any alliance. You're not just fighting the enemy in front of you. You're fighting the ghosts and the loyalties standing right beside you. And while we were having our own civil war, Mark, my ex-husband, was living in a completely different reality. A reality where he was still the king, completely unaware that a quiet, patient wolf was already heading straight for his door. Well, our house had become a pressure cooker, boiling with whispered arguments and fear. My ex-husband, Mark, was living in a completely different world, a world where he was king. I wasn't there, of course, but I know his world. I helped build it. I can picture it perfectly. He'd be in his corner office on the 30th floor, the kind with floor-to-ceiling windows that make you feel like you own the entire city. He'd just closed some massive deal, the kind that gets your name in the company newsletter. He'd walk through the office, all charm and charisma, slapping backs, making people laugh, probably throwing some flirty line at his new assistant, just inappropriate enough to be a power move. He's a master of his own universe. A universe built on confidence, control, and the unshakable belief that he's the smartest person in any room. That's what you have to understand about Mark. To him, life isn't a series of events, it's a game. And he always plays to win. He probably thinks I didn't escape him. I just moved to a different square on his personal chessboard. And Michael, my new husband, in Mark's mind, he wasn't a threat, just another pawn, a sad little architect who lucked into his former queen. He'd be leaning back in that big leather chair, looking out at the city he believed he owned, feeling completely and utterly invincible. He had no idea that a quiet, patient wolf was in the elevator, heading straight for his door. I can just hear it. The buzz of the intercom cutting through the self-satisfied silence of a man who thinks he's just won the day. I imagine his new assistant's voice, shaky, uncertain. She wouldn't know what to make of the man in reception. The whole thing plays out in my head clear as day. "Mr. Thorne?" I can hear her say it, hesitant. "There's a Mr. Michael Harrison here to see you. He doesn't have an appointment, but he insists." And I know exactly how Mark would react. A slow, arrogant smile spreading across his face. This wasn't an interruption. It was entertainment. "Send him in," he'd say, leaning back in his chair, already scripting the story for later. This should be fun. But the man who walked into his office wasn't fun. Michael wouldn't have brought a storm. He would have brought a drop in temperature. No anger, no noise, just presence. I imagine him standing in the doorway, quiet, solid, a shadow inside Mark's glass and chrome world. His eyes would scan everything. The expensive art, the massive desk, the skyline outside the window, not with envy, but with cold calculation. He was measuring the space, sizing up the man, because here's the thing about real confrontations, the kind that change everything, they don't start with a shout. They start with silence. It was a battle of two different kinds of predators. Mark, the loud, charming snake, who poisons you with a smile and a perfectly timed insult, and Michael, the quiet, patient wolf, who just watches and waits for the perfect moment to strike. I can see it all in my mind's eye. Mark leaning against his expensive desk, arms crossed, dripping with confidence, enjoying himself. "To what do I owe the pleasure, Michael?" he'd say, smirking. "Come to get some decorating tips?" Michael wouldn't take the bait. He'd just step into the room, slow, deliberate, his voice calm, controlled. "I came to give you a warning. Stay away from my wife, stay away from my house, and stay away from Chloe." A declaration. Simple, direct. And that is Mark's favorite game, poking the bear just to see if it'll roar. "Your wife, your house," he'd taunt, laughing. "Chloe is my daughter, and Jessica, well, she always had a soft spot for me. You should be careful. He gets bored easily." He was trying to get a reaction, and he did. Not a loud one, a small one, a tiny shift that only someone like me would recognize. I imagine Michael's hands just hanging by their sides, slowly, almost imperceptibly curling into fists. And that's the terrifying thing I've learned about Michael. His anger isn't an explosion, it's a compression. It builds in silence, getting denser, sharper, more dangerous. Mark saw that fist and thought he was winning. He thought he'd found the button. He had no idea. He had just armed the bomb. I know exactly what Mark would have done next. Seeing Michael's clenched fist, he would have felt that surge of superiority, that thrill of the win. He would have thought, I've got him. Mark always knows how to find the button and push it. He thinks it's his superpower. I picture him walking around his desk, closing the distance, getting right in Michael's face. He'd lower his voice into that patronizing, condescending tone, the one he used on me for years. "Let me give you a piece of advice," he would have sneered. "You're playing in a league you don't understand. I can ruin you. I can take my daughter back, and I can have Jessica eating out of the palm of my hand again by next Tuesday." And then he would have delivered the final fatal blow, the one line designed to dismantle a man. "She's weak, always has been." That's the line. That's the gut punch. And in that moment, I know Michael would have finally acted, but not in the way Mark expected. A man like Mark expects a punch. It's a language he understands. It's simple, primal, over quickly. But Michael is not a simple man. I imagine he wouldn't have touched Mark at all. He'd do something far more precise, far more cruel. He'd reach over, and with one deliberate sweep of his hand, he'd send the neat stack of contracts, the biggest deal of Mark's quarter, scattering across the floor. And then he'd take a single step, grinding the important papers beneath his shoe. A quiet act of absolute dominance. It wasn't about hurting Mark's body. It was about destroying his work, his power. And then I see him reaching for the one thing on Mark's desk that held any real value, the silver-framed photo of Mark and Chloe. That's the terrifying lesson about a man like Michael. His violence isn't chaotic. It's architectural. It's designed to hit you right in the foundation. Mark was probably expecting a punch. He would have been ready for it, maybe even welcomed it. A simple, messy brawl would have put him back in control. But I imagine Michael didn't even raise his voice. He would have picked up that silver-framed photo of Mark and Chloe, his movements slow and deliberate. He'd look at the picture, then look up, his eyes locking with Mark's. And his voice when he spoke would have been a whisper. A whisper more terrifying than any scream. "You think this is about Jessica. You think this is about you being charming, or about money, or about who wins. You're wrong." He'd take a step closer. "This is about you disrupting my family, my structure. I build things, Mark. It's what I do. And I protect what I build. You are a threat to my design. And I eliminate threats." I bet for the very first time in his life, Mark was speechless. The smug, confident smile would have vanished. Because in that moment, he would have finally understood. He wasn't dealing with some sad little architect fighting over an ex-wife. He was looking at something else, entirely.
something cold, calculating, and utterly obsessed with control. And that's the lesson Mark would have learned in that silent, terrifying office. You can't win the game when you don't even understand the rules your opponent is playing by. Michael wasn't playing for love or jealousy. He was playing for keeps. He had delivered his warning. And now, he was coming home. Back at the house, we were living on borrowed time. Every minute felt like an hour. We were just waiting for the fallout, the sound of a car door, the turning of a key in the lock. When Michael finally came home, the silence he brought with him was heavier than any words. He didn't look at me. He didn't say a thing. He just walked straight past us, went into his office, and closed the door with a quiet, definitive click. The battle was over, and now he was retreating to his fortress to plan his next move. But I knew the real fallout was happening somewhere else. Miles away, in his now disheveled office, I imagine Mark wasn't feeling so smug anymore. I picture him pacing, his hands probably shaking, not just with rage, but with a new, unfamiliar feeling: fear. And when Mark gets scared, he does what he always does. He reaches for his most reliable weapon. He would have called Chloe. "Chloe, what the hell did you tell that psycho? He just came to my office." And in our living room, Chloe, who was quickly becoming a master of this dangerous game, played her part perfectly. "I don't know, Dad. He and Mom were fighting, and he just got angry and left. I'm scared." She hung up, her face pale. And I saw it in her eyes, the tough lesson she had just learned. She had seen a glimpse of the real man behind the charming facade of her father, and the real monster behind the calm facade of her stepfather. She was standing between two very different but equally dangerous men, and the walls were closing in on all of us. The confrontation was over, but it had an unintended and terrifying consequence. It had woken up the snake. I can just picture Mark alone in his high-rise office, the carefully constructed world of his ego completely shattered. A man like Mark doesn't just get scared. He gets curious. The rules of the game had changed, and he needed to know why. The arrogant, charming predator who thought he was playing with a sad little architect had just been threatened by something much, much colder. And so, the man who never cared about anyone but himself would have done something he'd never done before. He'd start to investigate someone else. I see him sitting at his computer, the smug confidence gone, replaced with a new, focused intensity. His fingers would fly across the keyboard, not to close a deal, but to open a dark, forgotten story. I can almost hear the thoughts running through his head. Eliminate threats? Who says that? What the hell is wrong with this guy? And what really happened to his first wife? He had gone to that office to win a game against a rival. He left with a chilling new question. And in his quest to understand the man who had threatened him, he had just stumbled onto the very same path of discovery that we were on. He was no longer just a ghost from my past.
He was now a second detective on the case.
My daughter's lie was meant to be a shield. Instead, it was a match dropped on a trail of gasoline. It lit a fire under the two most dangerous men in my life and forced them into a battle of wills we never intended. We thought we were playing a quiet game of chess in the shadows, trying to uncover the truth about Michael. We never imagined that our biggest, most reckless move would bring a second player to the board. We thought we were the only ones investigating Michael. We were wrong. Now, Mark is digging into Michael's past, not for justice, but for his own selfish reasons. He's no ally. He's an enemy of my enemy. And I have no idea if that makes him more dangerous or our only hope. We created a monster. And now, we've accidentally created a monster hunter. So I have to ask you, who is more dangerous right now? The quiet wolf, Michael, or the angry snake, Mark? Vote in the comments, Michael or Mark. And you have to subscribe. Episode 10 is the mid-season finale. Mark uncovers the first real clue about Sarah's death. Our own investigation finds a devastating new piece of evidence, and it all leads to an explosive cliffhanger that you will absolutely not see coming. Hit that bell. You do not want to miss this.